Good afternoon, everyone. It's absolutely wonderful to be here in this setting. It can't get better. And I'm particularly happy that KLF asked us to do a session on democracy and electoral processes in the South Asian region and, of course, India. And when we speak of that, it's not just the nuts and bolts of governance, something which is far away from us, because really the electoral process is the building block of democracy. The fact that we can sit and have free exchange of ideas and literature and art or express our imaginations is only a secondary ancillary product of having a democracy in the first place. So I'm really excited here to be speaking with Navin Chawla, who's been the Chief Election Commissioner. And in this context, when we speak of the South Asian region, it's an interesting statistic that this region holds 60% of the democratic population of the world. And yet, we are kind of surrounded by, and ourselves being accused of being an illiberal democracy. We have autocratic regimes around us, we've had dictatorships around us. So, today we'll be focusing on the challenges in the region, the challenges within our country, and of course, what are the reforms that can happen to make us more secure as a democracy. And also we look at the aspect that is elections really the strongest face of democracy, or is it as important to have a constitutional democracy as an electoral democracy? I'll just throw one other statistic to you, which is that when we look at, India is fated as the greatest electoral carnival in the world, and we have much to be thankful for. But at the same time, we are looking at muscle power, money power, and here's one statistic to give us how unruly our elections can be, is that we have 2,900 electoral parties registered in our country. So when we speak to Navin Chawla about trying to govern this infrastructure, we'll understand the sheer scale of what it means to create free and fair elections. And we have 400 million people who sometimes are, the statistic says they don't end up voting because the structures can't reach them. So that's just to give a scale of what is at stake. With that, I'm going to, dive into this, Navin. I'm going to start with the easier aspect of this, which is to compare the region with India. As I said, India is seen as the carnival of democracy across the world. Nothing greater in enterprise terms than us, and we've largely had free and fair elections. But recently we were downgraded by VDEM and Freedom House into being, an illiberal democracy or a partial democracy. But we'll come to that. In comparison to the rest of South Asia, give us a sense of how optimistic you're about India. So run us through our neighborhood first.
Thank you, Shoma. As you said, lovely to be here. Who can have a better festival than being on the beach? So we are tempted to go into the sea, but now for an hour I have to concentrate on what you're going to throw at me. I take you all back to 1947, 48, 49, 50, when a clutch of nations got independence from British Empire. We got ours in 1947, and all the other countries in our neighborhood which had their different parties, freedom parties. And so eventually, during the course of about 5 years, most of the countries of South Asia attained freedom. The British, as they left, did not prepare any of these countries for elections. The nearest we came was the 1935 election in India, and that was also very limited electorates to people who were wealthy and educated. So we were not prepared for elections in any way. And finally the British, as they left a very ruinous structure. There was really no structure. I don't want to, I have a book on India, I am Indian, but I don't want to concentrate too much on India.
But though I will draw you back to India.
Yeah, you must. But it mustn't look as if I, being invited to speak on South Asia, am limiting myself only to India. And I'm sure you'll agree. So, if I begin with the independence of India, which came before the other nations in 1947, we were at that time a country that had been prepared for freedom, but not prepared for institutions. The result was that we had the Constituent Assembly quickly in place, and for 2 years the Constituent Assembly debated every aspect of what the Constitution should look like. So remember, we get a Constitution right in the beginning. It's a thinking Constitution, a lot of work has gone into it, and in that the Electoral Commission of India also gets, as I might term, as pride of place, meaning an election commission with enormous powers, which were demonstrated to us much later by T.N. Session, who showed us what could be done with those. Anyway, while that was going on in India, we had our first election in 1951-52, and then as the countries became independent, they also had their first elections in much the same mold as India's Communist Freedom Party. They all had freedom parties, and they all began to have their elections under very distinguished freedom fighters. Some of them worked towards written constitutions. In Nepal, for example, it didn't happen until much more recently. So every path was not the same. It was uneven. I take you to two words that Shoma has mentioned just now about money and muscle power. In India, our first election was 1951-52. I would urge all of you to buy my book and read that well-researched chapter. And in case you haven't, Shoma, you might like to, because the first election and the first election commissioner always has the most difficult task, because you're creating something out of nothing. So our first 3 or 4 or 5 elections went off well, until we came to the 80s in our country. And in 80s we now begin to see oligarchic influences, money, muscle power. The muscle man, the Don, who is lending his or her power to the candidate, suddenly says that why shouldn't I stand myself? And the game changes.
Yeah. So, Navin, I wanted to bore you into specifics. So before we dive into India, and naturally both the audience, you and I, are particularly interested in India, but not so much the history, because there are too many countries around us. Just give us a status report on Bhutan, on Bangladesh, on Nepal, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Afghanistan. Let's just look at this circle of countries around us in the current context, so that we can understand what is optimistic about India in the context of what's happening, like a circle around us, and then let's focus on India. So I'll ask you for a very quick status report on the countries around us, and that will give us how happy we should feel, and then we'll go into why we should be unhappy.
What is very quick?
Sorry?
What is very quick?
What is very quick? Like 5 minutes?
See, I'm bound now by times to talk about South Asia. Let's begin with Bhutan, a country which is an absolute monarchy, and where the king decides that he is moving the country to democracy. And we're very grateful in the Election Commission of India that the Kingdom of Bhutan invited us to help them with the elections, which we did. And we did a mock election as well, because people there couldn't understand what elections were about and why the king wanted them for it. So we had no political parties there, no candidates, so we made 4 artificial political parties in the primary color, red, blue, green and yellow, and set off for a mock election. And perhaps it's no surprise, but it was a surprise to me, that 99% of the vote went to yellow, because yellow was the king's color. So we moved on from there, and you'll be very interested to know that Bhutan has had 3 general elections, and in all the 3 general elections, Bhutan has changed its government. So that's an act of great maturity. Nepal, Nepal, we all follow closely. One day I attended a function and there were so many prime ministers on the stage in Kathmandu that I didn't quite know who came first and who came second. But it's had a number of governments and finally it does have a constitution. But there are hiccups as Nepal begins to ease into a level playing field kind of democracy. On Pakistan, we all know that it slipped into military rule very early in its democratic moorings, and although democratic governments have come from time to time, or let me put it this way, civilian governments have come from time to time. Those civilian governments have been moored in some way or kept in place by the army. So it remains a country which is not democratic, but in today's definition, as I come to it, I don't really know what's democratic any longer. What was democratic in 1950 is that democratic today, but I have other reasons than Shoma can think about just yet. So we had that in Nepal. You've seen Afghanistan was not part of the empire because no country could ever rule it. And it's completely Talibanized, as you all know. Then Burma had one prime minister, and then after that martial law, and we're all seeing the plight of Aung San Suu Kyi, who's been given almost every week she's given another 2 years or 3 years, and we know her and feel extremely sorry that she will probably end her life in captivity. There is no sense of any democracy except army rule.
And then there's Sri Lanka.
And when we come to Sri Lanka, Sri Lanka is quite interesting in today's format. The reason is that it's very unhappy with its government. There are food shortages, there are fuel shortages, there are shortages of every kind. And this was a kind of French Revolution of 1789 that took place that threw out the Rajapaksas. So popular protests on the street threw out the Rajapaksas. One had to flee, and Ranil was installed, although really in parliament he only had his one vote. So now Sri Lanka is preparing for elections. Bangladesh, Sri Lanka have helped with elections over the years, so I'm in a position to compare it with India as well. Bangladesh is also preparing for elections, but I'm not sure how happy the Bangladeshis themselves feel about their election commission. So are my 5 minutes up?
Just because there's so many strands to explore, so I'm going to keep Navin on a leash because, it's an encyclopedic topic.
मैं भी पूछ रहा हूँ कितने मिनट है भाई?
So I just wanted to say that when you see, and Navin has just done a status report of the countries around us, that there is much to be happy for in India because, for one, in 1950, we gave ourselves a democracy that gave adult franchise to everyone. And neither America nor England, the supposed oldest democracies, have really done that. So we gave adult franchise to everyone regardless of caste, gender, religion. So that is something to be tremendously happy for. And except for the aberration of emergency, we've by and large had the, proportionately free and fair elections. And like you said, one indication is that despite money power, despite muscle power, governments have been thrown out almost on a cyclical basis, so something is healthy. And also we've seen what happened in Brazil and America where when people don't trust the election, how dangerous that can become. So I'm rushing through all this to say that there is a lot of reason for us to be happy for. But Navin, we also know that there is a lot of anxiety about the status of democracy in India. And there are many reasons for that. You know, we mentioned muscle, money, independence of institutions, the EVM, reliability of, representation.
I never said anything about the EVM.
I'm saying
I hold it to be completely healthy.
Oh, I'm going to come to that. But you just said that you're worried about democracy in India for perhaps reasons other than mine. What would you pick as the biggest threat, or what you're most worried about in electoral democracy in India?
First, a little bit more about that money and muscle power. So in the 80s, we begin to get all these muscle men entering into parliament. They're no longer supporting you. They are now in for themselves. And if you look at all the press sitting in front, if they could just give us a figure of the crore-patis, by which I mean at least 5 crores declared income, plus the number of cases which they have to mandatorily declare because of the Supreme Court. So can you imagine that we have a furor in our country and we're rocking with anger because of Nirbhay, and yet if you look at the affidavits of our members of parliament, there are many who have declared rape. And our newspapers don't take it up, as indeed they should. So we are a country where we are made up of a parliament which is oligarchic. And if I look at the other parliaments in the region, I find that most of them, such as those that are working, are equally oligarchic. So you and I don't have a chance of getting into parliament. Not a chance. And we are expected to vote for a fair candidate. And our parliament is now a very cozy club. Have you noticed, Shoma, that whatever may be the fight at the hustings, can you give me one case as a veteran journalist of one MP criticizing another in parliament? Has a single political party, whether in government or in opposition, asked for electoral reforms? The Election Commission has sent in 36 reforms over 25 years, and not one is implemented. Not one is taken. An opposition party may make noise, but the party in government, which can be in opposition yesterday or tomorrow, nothing. Even a single individual member has not raised the issue of electoral reforms. So then where are we?
Right. You know, you mentioned the money power, so let's just stick with that for a moment. One is that you said only very rich people today can make it to parliament. So one, the representational of, what people are really feeling or want done, that's being undercut. And then there's the criminality, 30% of the parliament has declared criminal records. So that's a very worrying thing. But the counter question I'd put to you, Navin, is that what is the way, when technocrats like, say, Nandan Nilekani stood for election, or Medha Patkar, who's been an activist for many, many years, stood for election, they all lost their tickets, So what is it about the electorate that does not give people a chance like this? So what is the fundamental breakdown in our election system? And to the other question you posed, where people have not raised doubts, I think today a really big issue is the electoral bonds, and that at least opposition parties have been raising. But because there's brute majority, there's no discussion even happening on electoral bonds, So could you address those two questions?
The thing about money power for a moment is that it can't be discounted. I'll give you one example, and one example is telling enough. At a party in Delhi, I ran into a member of parliament from one of the southern states. I won't mention that. So I said, why do you people spend so much money? He said, are you asking me how much I spent? I said, no, I wasn't asking you that. But he said, I'll tell you. I know that the limit is 70 lakhs, but I spent 52 crores. And if you think that I was the highest, I was not, so and so spent over 70 crores. So then, where is our model code of conduct? Where are our rules? Where are our regulations? You can spend 50 crores. You can show something on the form is accepted, and you're into parliament. And then when you're in parliament, what are you going to look after? Me? You? No, you look after your own interests. So that's what I mean, that we have become oligarchical. And that heady, dangerous mixture put in 30% of this gunda masala. Now, one reason for that, and I'll just briefly mention, and I'd like you to say something, is that when I ask people that why do you vote for such a person, they say the criminal justice system in our country is broken down. Ye zameen ki problem hai, this is a marital problem, we have local problems, and then there's nobody there to solve it for us. But if he is the local Don MP, we can get a solution. So our justice system, whatever the courts may say, is in shambles.
No, that's true, Navin. I mean, I feel like it's a bit like unraveling an onion. You take off one layer, there's a more putrid layer below that. Then you take off another layer, there's a more putrid layer below that. So, there's no end to what is going wrong. And yet, somehow, our democracy does survive. So that's interesting. And I'd like you to analyze why, like I said, why are governments, despite all this, booted out? In Tamil Nadu, for instance, where we'll come to this again, where there is a lot of quote-unquote freebies given out during elections, and yet there was a constant, Jayalalitha in, Karunanidhi out, and then, there was a pendulum going. And that's been the case even in, like for instance, with the BJP, with all the power they have now, they've just lost Himachal Pradesh. So something in the electoral persists, But before that, you've seen this up close. How is that money spent, Navin? How does that percolate down the entire system? Can you give us a sense of that?
Let me begin with the last bit. And a state quite close to yours. See, I'm sitting in Kerala, not mentioning Kerala. I'm coming to Tamil Nadu for a minute. So, we in the Election Commission put 2,000 senior officers all over the country. We pulled them out for 1 month from their jobs as joint secretaries to the government. And yet, the local candidate has so much wisdom that they elude us. For example, after one election, we learned that 500 rupees was slipped into every newspaper. There were cases where goons would go in the middle of the night and take milk and put the bowl before the deity, make the person put his right hand in and say, here's the money and swear you'll vote for me. Now, there's no limit to human ingenuity, but it's not restricted to India. I have seen nothing but candidates' human ingenuity in every election that I've been an observer in the world. But I would like to say something about India, which is very positive. Right from 1951-52, our first election, we've held every election on time, every time. And much more interesting than that, and a great testimony that continues, it hasn't been dismantled, is that the loser accepts the position of the winner. They give way gracefully. They might ask for a recount, but the political party that loses hands over the baton of power to the winner. So this is an enormous strength. And where does it come from? Needs to also be analyzed. I have been to countries like in South America, Mexico, wouldn't accept a result. Sat in the public chalk of Mexico City for 11 months in blocked traffic. To Venezuela, not accepting a result, standing on the pavement and beating a utensil from 7 to 7:15 every evening, and so on.
Right. But, just sticking with this money factor, that what would be the way to curb it? You said you pull out 1,000 officers and it's still, So unless the election commission gets a police force of its own, there's no way to police this. So is there any substantive reform that can be done? And I'll come to the other aspects of the money question, which is the electoral bonds, because now one party has got almost a 600 or 700% increase in the funding that they are getting, whereas other parties are not getting that funding. So, every reform seems to open up a new Pandora's box. So if in an ideal world, Navin, what is the reform that is possible to create to curb this money power in politics?
Shoma, I've thought about it for many years and also written. So I'm on record that the kind of elections that I would see are no longer these elections which are funded by, these amorphous means. I feel the answer lies in a state funding of election. Now you may argue for this variety of state funding or that variety of state funding, but there are plenty of models of state funding of elections all over Northern Europe and so on. It only requires, many commissions have sat, right from the Indrajit Gupta Commission suggesting state funding of either candidates or political parties. But once we get into state funding, then neither you nor I have to run around to get funds, and winnability doesn't become an issue. One day I ran into the head of a political party at the airport, and I said, "Why have you put so many criminals on the list of an upcoming election?" He said, "देखिए नवीन जी, अभी तो हमारे इलेक्शन सर पे है, elections are on our head. We have to, we are only concerned with winnability. After election is over, आप मुझे बुलाओ, you call me to your office, and I'll sign on the dotted line for state funding of elections," which of course he had no interest in doing. But my answer to this, Shoma, is some form of state funding. Because if you don't have that, then every single candidate who is here will be guided by the mantra of winnability. I have to win by hook or crook.
So, you've just mentioned that all these reforms that you've put forward, there's been no party that's ever wanted to take it up. So I'm just going to shift gear a little bit. We're speaking about the electoral process, and you said you have no issues over the EVMs, but there are enough people who've been raising issues even about the EVMs, because there are three fundamental flaws with it, which is that people, the voters not able to see who they've casted a vote for. They're not able to ascertain that it went for those who they cast a vote for, and that if there's a discrepancy, they're not even able to call it out, and there's in fact a penalization of that. So why are you so sanguine about the EVM? We don't know who designed it. Now that the public institutions that were producing it, the contract is over. It's private companies that are producing these EVMs. The design of these EVMs is not open for public scrutiny. We don't know who's producing them. And the voter doesn't know whether the button they pressed actually went to who they were pressing it for. Why are you then not concerned? There's an essential design defect with that.
It's a very interesting question, particularly for me to answer. I had just completed the 2009 general election in May, and in July, Subramaniam Swamy and other political parties said that they were not satisfied, that it was a rigged election. So, in the election commission, we put our heads together with all the experts who were designing the machine and so on, and put 100 machines, 10 from each state, on the floor of the election commission, and invited anyone, journalists, political parties, anyone, to come and rig the machine there. So we could get no consensus. Some people wanted to take the machine away, and I said that's not possible. Even I can't take the machine home. The patent lies with somebody else. But if you consider this to be an average polling station in Tripura or in Kerala or in West Bengal, then rig. So I put cameras because the matter was already in the High Court. So I said, let's make it admissible in evidence. So nobody could rig it there, but they all wanted information on the barcodes and other details that I and the Election Commission was not the manufacturer and had no authority to give. After a week of this, Swami said to me that, okay, let's get a paper trail. That's how we started developing the VVPAT, whereby when you press the button for candidate ABC, that candidate's name plus party symbol will appear. And you have 7 or 8 seconds to be able to be sure that you voted for the button that you have pressed. In all of India, when we first used it in the recent general election, there were a few complaints, but for 800 million polling stations, the complaints were few and far between. In other words, it worked. And the political parties have accepted it. Because what is an election commission? It's an umpire, isn't it, of political parties? We have to try and create a level playing field. But everybody there in India knows their rights. They are very argumentative. They can be extremely cantankerous. And they have a right to be. We felt that we had satisfied them. And there's another important issue which all of you will surely understand. Unlike Venezuela or some county in the United States or some parts of Mexico, the EVM is guarded by a district magistrate who is an IAS officer. And suppose you're the IAS officer and you have 10,000 EVMs that you have to store between elections in that warehouse where the keys and responsibility lie with you. How will you allow 10,000 of those to be rigged? Will you allow me to come in at midnight? Will somebody not take my picture? Will there not be double locks by political parties?
So Navin, in a way you've said that this accusation of rigging is one of the more frivolous accusations of the Indian election. So 2 questions, because we're going to run out of time and I want to open this up, is that, I just mentioned that we've slipped in that democracy index. Of course, the BJP government really pushed back on VDEM and on Freedom House when they said that India has become a partial democracy because of the way that our institutions are compromised, the way the media is compromised, freedom of expression is compromised. So there were 12 indexes on which they were rating the democracy and said that India has slipped. And the government pushed back on that. So I want to come to that independence of institutions, Navin, that how independent do you think that, at a time when there's such a debate going on about the appointment of judges, there's a lot of anxiety over the independence of the judiciary, the media. Let's come to the Election Commission. On a scale of 10, what report card would you give your own commission? How independent is the Election Commission today and in your time?
I want to answer this question completely differently. And I'll tell you what worries me, not just about, and I've had a lot of experience in this field. So if I don't share that with you, I'm not being entirely fair. I can be, first, when I did the elections, I didn't want anyone to comment on the way I did it. There were newspapers to write it. I have been asked a plethora of questions by all your friends, Barkha and Karan and all that, and I have refused to answer on any of my successors' election commissions and how they did it because I didn't know all the facts. How could I just comment? But I'll tell you what has deeply disturbed me and will continue to disrupt elections all over the world in the time to come. It doesn't matter if they have an election commission which is strong or weak. But what has now come is the use or misuse of technology. You watched in 2015 how a group of 12 Russians who formed a particular company disrupted elections in the United States and disrupted Hillary's election. You only have to read Hillary's own account to know how that happened. and very few denials from the Kremlin. Today, Cambridge Analytica from Cambridge analyzed your preferences, Shoma's likes, Shoma's dislikes, Shoma's prejudices, and was able to keep throwing at her that what she liked and what her prejudices
and
were.
fake news and fake
And
political
fake news and paid news. So 2008 was when paid news hit me and I saw what it was like. And now we've gone far beyond fake news and paid news because the fake news is coming from the internet. It's bombarding your Twitter. It's bombarding Facebook. Everything you say in Facebook, whether you like hot chocolate at night or whichever way you're made up, if that can be used for you or against you in an election, that is what you will have. Not only you, all of us living in the developed world where there is internet and the technology. You know that Mark Zuckerberg was summoned by Congress and gave no answer.
Yeah.
He's been summoned by the British House of Commons and has not gone.
So, Navin, like I said, we could keep talking about this for another 5 hours because we haven't even begun to touch upon some of the other flawed aspects of our electoral process and then our democracy. But, I still want to come to this. You talked about the structural way to, clean up the influence of money. I wanted to ask you, because of the raging controversy right now over the appointment of judges, that, there have been controversies around the election commissioners. You yourself were seen as very close to the Congress. Current election commissioners are seen as partial to the BJP. When Ashoka Lavasa said that, he had a dissenting vote on how his commissioner was giving, clean chits to the BJP government, his dissenting vote was not even listed. So there have been a lot of worrying controversies around commissioners as well, and the appointment of commissioners. Now, if we take it for granted that every government will appoint people who are somewhat allied with them, then what is the structural way in which we, the people, can protect ourselves against that very natural instinct of governments to choose people who are close to them?
You see, all governments will choose people close to them. All American governments will choose judges close to them. It's a question of what you do when you get into that chair and what's perceived as close. In political parties, I see that the politicians don't seem to be steady in one party. Everybody's hopping from one party to the other. So, what allegiance are we talking about?
Don't open another putrid layer.
No, hear me out.
Yeah.
You're talking to a former election commissioner with huge experience. So you have to be patient with my answer. The thing is that, as I said, every government has to appoint somebody. Ultimately, are you responsible in your conscience to the people of India or are you not? That is your conscience call. But what we have been trying very hard for, and I particularly, is the flaw in our election system. We have a chief election commissioner who's protected completely by the Constitution, and we have 2 other election commissioners who are completely unprotected. So if they do not do what the chief wants, then the chief will do this to them, which the chief tried to do to me, and I said go to hell because I am not obliging you in any way, and unlike Lavasa, I must have put in 12 dissenting notes. They're all on record. So it's not that dissenting notes, it's just that I gave them no newspaper. I didn't ring you up and say, Shoma, hello, I put in a dissenting note. But I'll come to this. The one reform that I would like to see is that the 2 election commissioners who are not completely protected by the Constitution, what I mean by this is that when the Constitution was formed, there was only 1 chief election commissioner. 2 were added. Those 2 who were added did not get the same protection in removal as the CEC. So the CEC is pretty independent of government. Who can impeach a CEC? You can't get 3 people together in parliament. But the other 2 are vulnerable. They're vulnerable to government's pressures, they're vulnerable to the CEC's pressure. And that's why when I finally, after this 2 years of attack on me, well, this was the crux of the matter, because as soon as I became CEC, everybody fell in line. They became so nice, had good bouquets of flowers and all that. But that's the point, Shoma, you have to take up. This is not just a
yeah,
one
because
way.
it can't be. I think the beauty of our constitution was that despite everything and despite individual leaders, we've survived as a democracy this long because
you grow some spine if you know that once you're in the seat,
Absolutely. Absolutely.
It's like the Republican judge that finally actually held out and did not go with the Republican vote in America. So I'm just going to open this up. My last question to you, Navin, is that just mention very briefly how this issue of electoral bonds should be looked at. It was brought in as a reform, but it has created a lot of anxiety.
It should be scrapped.
Okay, that's a strong, good statement, but why?
It should be scrapped. Electoral bonds, because nothing is transparent. So how can we live with something that is not transparent? The whole idea of all the 36 reforms that we have given to various governments are all aiming for transparency.
Right. Okay, on that note, I'm going to open this up. When we were talking about institutions, the judiciary, the election commission, the parliament itself, I think the one thing all of us need to look at, and certainly me as a journalist, is the independence of the media. And it's, I think, in a very difficult state. I'm just going to share one anecdote related to elections, which Manish Tiwari, who was a Congress MP, actually put on record. And he said, during elections, all media take, or not all, a lot of media outfits take money for favorable coverage. And, I think he would have done the same. And he woke up one morning very dismayed because I'm not going to name the paper, but clearly his opponent had also paid the same publication, because on top there was a headline which said in Punjabi, Manish Tiwari balle balle, and below that it said Manish Tiwari thalle thalle, and which basically means there was a rah-rah news report on him on top, and there was a negative report on him below, just below the fold on the same page. And that gives us some indication of what the challenges that Indian elections and democracy face. So I'll just leave that as food for thought and open this up.
I congratulate both of you, sirs and madam. Very insightful discussion. My name is Gopal Krishna. I am from Bangalore. Sir, maybe your senior IAS officer, M.G. Devasahai, has written a book, Electoral Democracy. Yes, what all you expressed, he has written in that book. It is available in this DC bookshop. He has raised the questions of 3M. We were talking only of 2M, money and muzzle, and he has also expressed doubts about machine, that is EVM machine. He has no problem with.
I'm sorry, sir, will you ask a question?
Yeah, my question is VVPAT, that counting, you agree that it is good, but they are not allowing for complete counting. They are only taking 5% of the. So that is not doing justice. Your opinion
Let
on
him
that.
just answer that.
Yeah. And second question is.
I'm sorry, there were some other hands. May I just stick with
I
one?
think 5% or 7% is sufficient. Because if you count every single vote, then you're doing the election all over again. So a percentage of whatever political parties agree with. If political parties agree that 5 should become 10, then we should make it 10.
Okay. Yes.
Okay, in Germany and US.
I'm sorry, may I take that away from you because there are others wanting to ask questions. Yeah, there's a lady in front. Sorry.
Thank you for the very insightful session, sir. So my question is relating to independence as well, like what ma'am just asked. So Article 324 relating to the election commissioner clearly says that the parliament can make rules, but there are no rules yet. the Goswami Commission and the law reports, everything says that there should be rules regarding appointment. But that lacuna is still there, and that is why election commissioners are bulldozed by the governments again and again. Even the Supreme Court pointed out that recently. So, in your opinion, would making the election commission a fourth organ or bringing about such an amendment in the constitution, would that help the current situation of the election commissions falling prey to the bulldozing of parties?
No, I believe at this stage in our country's development, there was very briefly when Mr. Session had become too authoritarian for the government of the day, the Narasimha Rao government appointed 2 more commissioners, Gill and GVG Krishnamurthy. And then, while it's very strong, meaning 2 could overrule 1. Our powers were the same. Our emoluments were the same. In every respect, we could take decisions. The only flaw, in my opinion, was not making the removal procedure as strong as that for the Cs. And if that can be done, as I personally urged the government of Dr. Manmohan Singh, when after much trauma, I became CEC, I told my other 2 colleagues, you don't sign this letter, you may be misunderstood, I will write, because I am now finally constitutionally secure. But sadly, no action. So if that little bit, that 12th mile could be done, it will be a much more strengthened election commission, and no government wants to do it.
Yes, there's a question here.
The power of the Chief Election Commission. But there is also the destruction of credibility. The CEC has constitutional power. But in the last election, in front of visible hate speeches, which is criminal action, the CEC was silent. Therefore, my query is, why after session, there is structural power at least on the part of CEC, but why there is so deliberate destruction of that power? Why that Southasian, that surrender to the executive authority? My second quick query is, your last statement about scrapping the electoral bond. How to do that? We all feel so helpless now about it.
That can only come from Parliament. Legislation lies there. If legislative power lay with the Election Commission, then our 36 reforms would have long since been implemented. So if you were to go on the net, please.
I think our mics are...
If you could please just glance over the reform proposals that we've suggested. They're all aimed at transparency of one kind or another. If only those could be, we would be a perfect
he also asked a question about electoral bronze and then about this.
Tenure, I can't answer for any tenure before. Was there surrender from 1952 onwards to 1980? I don't know, and it's not a question that I can, and I can't answer it knowledgeably because you never know the compulsions of the person who might be in that chair. Why has some Supreme Court judge brought out this judgment and not that judgment? Very difficult to talk.
I'm going to have to end it here because our hosts want the next session to begin. But like I said, when we're discussing this, it's not something remote from us. Just yesterday's news, the Rajya Sabha chairman said that the basic structure of the constitution is not something he believes in and that parliament should have complete power over the nature of the constitution. So, this, as I said, the very fact that this festival can happen, we have free speech, everything really depends on, as his book said, every vote counts, and how we put that vote is the fundamental building block of democracy. And at a time when we are seeing governments literally being created, horse trading, people being bought, we call it hotel politics. There's a lot that is problematic about Indian elections, and I think we should constantly fight it and speak up about it. And at the same time, celebrate the fact that 800 million people vote, and despite this putrid onion, as I said, governments are thrown out and new governments are brought in, and we continue to survive as a democracy. So there's a lot to be positive about, but I think the fighting and the speaking up is really, really imperative. So thank you so much, Navin, for being here with us, and thank you, everyone.